next session, Pathway to Utopia, the Promise and Perils of Unregulated Future Tech. This is a huge area that has many facets. And so what we thought we would focus on in this conversation in particular is the pathway that artificial intelligence is felt to represent towards realizing utopia. So before I get started, let me remind you to please use the Whova app to submit questions. And I've got a little iPad here that the questions will show up on. Let me tell you the format of what we hope to do here. We've got 4 terrific speakers, and I'm not one of them, so you can see that there's someone's missing here. And so remotely, one of our speakers is in Cambridge, and so she will appear in good time. But each of these speakers has an incredible background. I'll mention a little bit about that in just a second. And so we've asked them to reflect on a particular area of artificial intelligence and the pathway to utopia. So we'll start off, each of them will give a very brief 3 to 5 minute look at a particular facet of this incredibly huge topic. And then we will converse amongst ourselves, discuss that for say 10 minutes or so, and then we'll move to the next one. So I had told one of our panelists, it's sort of like speed dating for geeks. We will try to move through all of these. Again, please bear in mind that, that volumes have been written about every facet of this topic. And so we just want to whet your interest there. So let me begin by briefly introducing our speakers. They have a more fulsome biography on the Whova app that you can look at, but just to put names with faces and so forth, I actually toyed with the idea of asking Alexa who these people were, and decided maybe that would seem to be tilting the discussion in one particular direction. So instead, I'll just give you a thumbnail sketch of each of them. Let me start with Andrew Briggs, who is Professor Emeritus of Nanomaterials at Oxford. He's a fellow of the Institute of Physics, as well as the International Society for Science and Religion. He is an expert, obviously, in nanomaterials, and in particular, how quantum computing can be realized with those materials and so forth for information processing and the like. And so when we get started, he will lead off and spend some time talking, 5 minutes, talking about that. Next to the right of Andrew there is Alison Dutman. If I've said the German last name correctly, I worry about that. She is a president and chief executive officer of Foresight Institute. She has many arrows in her quiver when it comes to talking about technology and futures. And so in particular, the reduction of existential risk due to technology is one of the things that she is especially known for, and especially those associated with artificial general intelligence, a term that it means that you have a intelligence capable of multifaceted integration of information, approaching that of a conscious mind, perhaps. Let me get the other person on the stage, just simply to make it easier for our technical people. To your right, Allison's left, there is Paul Davies. Paul Davies is a Regents Professor at Arizona State University. He's the director of Beyond, the Center for Fundamental Concepts in Science. He's also a jack of all trades, a theoretical astrophysicist, cosmologist, great humanitarian, big thinker, all of those things. And he's particularly interested in the nature and origin of life, and a particular interest to our panel discussion today, just to take an angle that perhaps you haven't thought about, is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And so those are the folks we have here now joining us remotely. If we can bring her image up. I don't know whether that's a hard thing to do or not, but Kanta Dihal is the senior research fellow in the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence. Her specialty ties into the previous two sessions. I was just thought how remarkable that worked out. In particular, she specializes in how narratives shape public understanding of artificial intelligence. One of the questions that we'll pose to her, what she'll talk about, is the role of rights, the rights that we grant in society, humans versus, or alongside, if you like, artificial intelligence. And so, again, a wonderful panel discussion we should have here in a moment. Please be sure to use Whova to submit your questions. The neat thing about Whova is if we don't get to your question, the questions are still there. And so one of our panelists will be able to address those. We had such a wonderful experience last year in our CORES event last year, where some of the conversations that started there went on for 6 months. It was a terrific thing. So please take advantage of that. So first of all, Andrew, then let me turn to you and get things started. Again, Andrew will talk for 3 to 5 minutes, but his views on quantum computing and artificial intelligence.
Oh, Barry, thank you very much. Well, thanks for your introduction.
Please use your microphone.
And is that working?
Push the button up to the right. The button here on
This one?
Yes.
Okay. The great thing about being an experimental scientist is you learn how to use these things. Thank you and your colleagues for convening this wonderful event and for this particular panel. We're also privileged to be here. Quantum computing offers the promise of being able to solve problems that are quite unfeasible with any foreseeable classical computer. Huge progress has been made in the last quarter of a century in developing quantum computing, but we're not there yet. And although there are some wonderful demonstrations around from some of the big companies like IBM and Google and the Chinese, and there's lots and lots of very exciting startup companies with new ideas, some of them are very clever, it's still a long time before quantum computing is going to be of practical use for problems that actually make a difference to us. Artificial intelligence, on the other hand, is already with us. And the form in which the greatest progress is being made is often called machine learning. And the emphasis is on the learning. So whereas hitherto you have programmed a computer to do a task for you, with machine learning, you program the computer to learn to do the task for you. And machine learning and quantum computing come together in my laboratory because we develop quantum devices. And for some years now, the experiments have become so difficult that we've needed the resources of machine learning to accelerate the experiments for us. And this has become so effective that it's now in use in a number of university laboratories around the world. And in fact, last year we spun out a company to make it available for commercial companies to use. Now, it's quite useful to distinguish between broad and narrow machine learning, what's sometimes called artificial general intelligence and artificial intelligence. And I'm looking forward to the dialogue with Allison and the others on the panel about this. My own view is that artificial general intelligence is way ahead in the future. It'll be a long time before we get there. I think scalable quantum computing will get there much earlier. There are some important issues to think about, which my colleagues at Oxford and others around the world think about. When you get to the point where the machines exceed the capability of humans to decide what the goals should be. But at the moment, all of the machine learning we do, we decide what the goals should be. And it's long been observed that any technology can be used for harm or for good. You can use iron-making metallurgy to make swords or to make plowshares. And the machine learning that I'm involved with, I'm a huge enthusiast for because of the benefits it brings in our research, the benefits for quantum computing and many other applications. The medical uses of machine learning are already stunning in terms of screening and diagnosis. But there are also the potential for harm. For example, last week, there was a report in the UK about well, it was from the Education Policy Institute and the Prince's Trust, and it was about the impact of social media on young people. And just to give you some of the examples of the findings, one in 3 girls was unhappy with their personal appearance by the age of 14. The number of young people with probable mental illness had risen to 1 in 6 from 1 in 9 in 2017. And boys in the bottom set at primary school had a lower esteem at 14 than their peers. And the key point about the report was that all of this was attributable to social media and networking. And if you think you're not subject to machine learning, well, either you're living in a world isolated from the internet or you're wrong and you are being subject to machine learning. So I wanted to finish with a little quiz. So you've all got to get out your Hoover app, if you may, please. And this is just to set us thinking about things. So if you go to the Hoover app for this session, and can I ask Pauline, have you got it in front of you? So I set 4 questions. And the first question is this: if you had a machine that knew less than your doctor, would you rather be diagnosed by that machine or by your doctor? And we've formulated the questions in a sort of yes-no format to make it very easy. What's the answer for that? Are we getting answers through yet, Pauline? Okay, so now we come to now we come to a site. It was interesting, those who'd rather be diagnosed by a machine that knew less than their doctor. I wonder who those people are. I hope we can talk.
But it was certainly leaning to no.
Yeah, okay.
So certainly leaning to no, but not solidly.
So now the next question is the other way around, okay? If you had a doctor who knew less than the machine, would you rather be diagnosed by the doctor or by the machine? So again, it was in a yes-no format. And what was the answer there, Pauline?
6 yes and 11, 6 yes and 11 no. So no predominates. Would you want to be diagnosed by a doctor who knew less than the machine?
Right. So now we can take it a step further. And it's not now about your health care, but we suppose that you've been found guilty in court of some crime. I know this will need a stretch of the imagination for most of us here, but just imagine it all the same anyway. Human judges are demonstrably inconsistent. There have been plenty of studies of that and plenty of measures of it. If you had a machine that could decide the sentence that was even less consistent than a human judge, would you rather be judged by the machine or sentenced by the machine or by the judge? So how many is that one, Pauline?
2 yes and 15 no.
Okay, you better explain what the yes and no mean.
Well, yes would be, would you want your sentence to be determined by a machine that is less than consistent than a human judge? And
right.
People don't want that.
So now we get the harder question, which is, suppose that the judge is less consistent than the machine. Which would you prefer to be sentenced by then?
Would you want to be sentenced by a judge who is less consistent than a machine? 7 yes, 11 no. So
Very
people want consistency.
I hope that this will lead to a useful discussion, Barry.
Okay. Right, thank you, Andrew. Now, just to tighten up one of the points that you're making, you made there. We talked about artificial general intelligence, and you said that you felt scalable quantum computing was closer on the horizon than that. But is there some problem in artificial general intelligence that you think can be, in terms of achieving artificial general intelligence, that you think is more likely to be surmounted by quantum computing, scalable quantum computing? I mean, is there some unique challenge that you can think of?
That's a terribly interesting question. I don't know of one. I don't know of one. And I think there are two reasons for that. First of all, one of the frustrations with the progress in quantum computing has been the lack of progress in uses for it. So, 20 years ago, when we were getting the effort started in the UK, at least in terms of the experiments, we were hopeful that there would be a steady flood of algorithms coming up that would make use of the unique capabilities of quantum information processing. And I have to say that it hasn't been a flood. In fact, it's scarcely been a trickle. So while there's huge progress on the pathway towards making scalable quantum computers, I think people are still struggling to know what they'd use them for. It might be actually for advances in machine learning, but advances in narrow machine learning, that is where we've already set what the task is, what the objective is, and the machine is learning how to do it. Now, on the artificial general intelligence, by which I mean the machines actually start setting their own goals, this is a wonderful and very important playground for speculation, because there are some important fundamental questions. I don't know of anybody who knows how we're actually going to do it, which may mean, I mean, some of my colleagues think it will never happen, but there are others who think, well, it might happen and we better start preparing for it intellectually and ethically.
Yeah, Allison, perhaps you'd like to comment on that. Be sure to switch on your microphone. Just push the button up there. Is it working?
Give it to me. I will help you. I'm not
It's working. Yes. Yes. Could you just rephrase what exactly is it that you would like me to comment on?
Well, the question that I put to Andrew may be clumsily phrased, but what barriers to achieving artificial general intelligence would quantum computing help address? But I actually think the latter part of his response is something I would like to hear you react to. What's your feeling about the horizon, the time horizon for when artificial general intelligence might be achieved?
Well, I think that there's a lot of
I'm not sure that this actually works. Give it to me again.
Okay, now it's working.
There you are, you see.
It's the magic touch.
Try that now.
Thank you. Lovely. Thanks a lot. Well, I think that, there's lots of disagreement on this, and I'm not an AI researcher, so, I would hate to comment on it from a, from the current use. But I think actually there was an Oxford conference at which a variety of Oxford researchers have actually were informally queried on this, and where very different timelines came out of that too. I do want to say though that I think that given that the big amount of disagreement, I think the more relevant question is how far along are we in making sure that these systems cooperate with humans at the time when that level is reached. And so I think rather than asking just when is the timeline of, when AI supersedes human capabilities, I think we should be asking how long will it take humans to make progress on actually making sure that these features go well for humans. So I think that, that delta is the one that I'm more concerned about.
Right, and that sort of segues into the question that you were on address. But Paul, you wanted to make a comment there?
It's a question really. So Frank Wilczek has coined the term quintelligence for a quantum intelligence. He really wasn't the first person to think about that, because I remember having a conversation in a BBC studio with David Deutsch, probably nearly 40 years ago, about conscious quantum computers and their mind states and so forth. And so the idea has been around a long time. What would it be like to be a quantum intelligence or a quantum computer, conscious quantum computer? It just seems to me that if we're going to have, if we're going to combine AI and quantum computing, we need to think a lot about the conceptual landscape that this entity is going to be able to explore. So it may be hard to write algorithms other than Shor's algorithm, Grover's algorithm, but if you let this thing loose, what is it going to be able to achieve? Because maybe it would be solving problems that we haven't even conceived of, because it would be in a mental world of its own. So that's a statement, really, but I'd be interested to know, both of you, whether you have any thoughts.
Well, I think that segues nicely then into the presentation that Allison's going to make about, in this case, embedding a moral framework, a values framework into artificial general intelligence. So Allison, do you want to go ahead and begin? And discuss
Sure.
that?
And again, I think actually with how you started the panel was really nicely put, in the sense that, on each of the discussion topics, we could be having a symposia and so after symposia on this, and we would still barely scratch the surface. So I think, with tackling the question of how can we possibly hope to embed morality into AIs, I think there's two really big words there. One is morality and one is AI. And both of these are really quite filling. But let me just, make a few points about both of them. Let me start with morality. I think that if one thing is really clear, is that we live in a society of value diversity and value pluralism, in the sense that, you only have to scroll through Twitter and it's really quite obvious that people don't agree. But even, and I come more from an ethics perspective here, that having been my background, having gone through trolley dilemma after trolley dilemma, I don't know if anyone here knows about them, but well, if you do, then also certainly that people don't really agree on what the right course of action there is. And, even looking through consequentialism, virtue ethics, looking through deontology, and looking through the rich ethical debate amongst really professionals that is still going on today, and then a variety of different religious theories, obviously, as well. I think we really come to a point that we really haven't come to one common human morality yet that is actionable enough that it could actually be enshrined. I think we certainly have made progress over the centuries, in the sense that many of the things that we now think of as biases were held on as values by previous generations. And so I think we are making progress to some extent. But I don't think we are at some kind of endpoint yet where we would want that to be the finite set that we encode in AIs. And so I think that, with that constraint in place, I think of my ethics as the ongoing negotiation between which of my intuitions I want to hold on to as values and which I want to let go of as biases. And it's a continuous updating. As I learn more about the world, that changes still to some extent. And I don't think I've really made much, I've come to an endpoint there yet. So that just a few points on morality, then a few points on AI. I think, as you mentioned, AIs have minds that are inconceivable to us, right? Or they may at least be able to operate at scales that are inconceivable to us. They certainly grow up on a very different substrate, right? Silicon, perhaps, and have very different software architecture than we do. And you already mentioned a few of the algorithms, right? And even having quantum algorithms, like the types of just constraints under which these AI systems will grow up are, I think, quite inconceivable to the human constraint. And I think that perhaps also the human norms are really very difficult to port into a system that mirrors nothing, that mirrors not very much of the human brain. Even though we have neural networks, they really only at best mirror very crudely of how our human morality or how our human brain really functions. And so I think that it's very difficult to come to an agreement on across humans on values, and then porting that into a system that has a fundamentally very different, I think, architecture and context will also be, I think, extremely difficult. And I worry that by trying to really kind of like implement a certain value code, we may end up within a very different world. I think many of us know the story like Midas touch from King Midas, right? So that's one of them. But there's also from Goethe, the Sorcerer's Apprentice, where the sorcerer's apprentice instructs the brooms to clean the house, but then doesn't know the spell of how to stop them. And so I think, and there's an AI alignment. Actually, we have the scenario of the paperclip maximizer, of instructing an AI system to maximize paperclips, and the AI system incorporates this and does it very well. So well, in fact, that it turns the entire universe, including all humans, into paperclips. What do I want to say with this? I want to say that what we from our current human hubris and context may instruct an AI, and that seems very obvious in our human context, may not be very obvious for systems that share very little of our upbringing, really. And so where does it leave us? I don't want to leave us really on this rather, let's say, difficult or rather like a problem perspective, but perhaps say a few words about what I think where we could go from here. And so I think we actually have a lot to learn from humans and from humanity, in the sense that, look, we are all here, not because we think that value diversity necessarily is a problem, but because we appreciate value diversity, in the sense that we not all of us share exactly the same notion of utopia, but nevertheless, we're here, we're conversing about it, and we are cooperating about it to the extent that we do share the same values. And so I think that we can learn a lot from AI systems for that, in the sense that if we can put structures in place that allow us to be independent from each other when we don't agree on things, but that allow us to cooperate on those that do, then I think we can learn a lot. And I think that that there's actually a few ways in which we can do that, right? Human, like AIs, don't have a free will, in the sense that they can't voluntarily engage in an action, but nevertheless, their computer systems are part of different networks of entities, and they operate by request making of other entities. So they communicate with each other, and objects can deny a request or can service a request. And so that is fundamentally very, very similar to how human beings cooperate in a society. And we have evolved institutions that allow us to cooperate much, much better across, like many years, and often very hardly and much hardship. And I think we can evolve similar institutions for cooperation across artificial intelligences, and also for cooperation across humans and artificial intelligences. And I think that by our lives moving more into the digital world, we are in fact already scratching these surfaces, in the sense that we already have ways in which we can cooperate with computer systems. And I think that probably my co-panelist will touch on this too when she talks about rights for AIs. And I think this kind of rights-based framework is really a very interesting one to explore. So rather, I think, than trying to rely on the fact that we have to come to one human morality and then enshrining that into an AI system in a reliable way, I think we should be learning from the systems that we're building. And I don't want to get down into the crypto discussions here, but for example, blockchain, what it does really is that it allows us to inspect the internal behavior of an agent. Like we know actually, and can use game theory, and then can actually enshrine that into a specific sets of norms and values and operating procedures. And so I think that these technologies that are now coming online that may seem on the surface like they have nothing to do with AI, we may be able to use to recreate the societal institutions that we already have, and using them to cooperate with AI systems. So that's my little intro.
Okay, all right. Well, that was quite a romp through a whole range of issues. Let me just touch on one, and that is that if I understand you correctly, I think I do, you don't think there's a universal values framework, a universal moral framework?
Well, I think that if there is one, we haven't found one yet, and we haven't agreed on one. And I think that, I worry that in the absence of that, it's a few people making these decisions and calling the shots when an AI has been sufficiently advanced. And I necessarily wouldn't trust a few folks to be able to speak for everyone at the time that an AI is reached. So I don't think we can, I think Nick Bostrom once called AI alignment something like philosophy with a deadline. And I just worry that we can't meet the deadline in time for AI systems to have arrived here, and that instead we may end up with something that we wouldn't have wanted if we really could have thought a bit longer.
One of the aspects of artificial general intelligence that both Andrew and Allison, you touched on, is this volitional capability of artificial general intelligence, that it could have a will and make decisions about what problems it wishes to pursue, and obviously then generate the schema to tackle those problems. One of the questions that came in over Hoover was kind of interesting, and maybe Andrew, you can volley that one a bit, and then volley it to Allison, see what she thinks. But the whole idea of novelty in AI is a capability that, for the most part, when we're just talking about general artificial intelligence, novelty isn't something one puts a premium on. I mean, if you have an artificial intelligence system operating an airplane, you don't want it to be creative. about flying an airplane. You would like it to be robustly predictable. So this question that came in asked if quantum computing could be a source of indeterminacy, novelty, when coupled to an artificial intelligence system. And so how would you respond to that, Andrew?
Oh, well, I love that. I love that question. Whoever asked it, thank them for it. Let me back off to lay a foundation and then come to the answer, which is the role of quantum indeterminacy in human responsibility. So the point about quantum indeterminacy is it gives a kind of indeterminacy, which is quite different from just the indeterminacy you get from a normal random number generator in classical computing. And people have sometimes tried to invoke that in the context of free will. So if, we as humans, we have brains that can be described by the science of neurophysiology, does that mean that all our choices are determined and therefore free will is elusive? And leaving aside the philosophical discussions of that, the question then comes along, well, aha, actually everything is quantum. So maybe this, hitherto kind of determinacy, sometimes called Laplacian determinacy, isn't there at all because there's quantum randomness. And again, leaving aside the philosophical questions, which you can discuss, it doesn't actually help you very much in practice, because what really matters is not whether a human creativity has free will, but whether I'm responsible. And to say that everything was fully determined mechanistically means that I'm not responsible. If you replace that by saying, well, the choices I make were quantum random choices, it might make them freer, but I don't see how it makes me any more responsible for them. So now let's come to, so I don't think it helps there. So now let's come to how quantum randomness and quantum computing might help in AI being creative. And already there are people who do assert that machine learning does demonstrate creativity. A famous example was when the machine called AlphaGo beat the world champion Lee Sedol in Korea at playing the game of Go. And it happened that in such and such a move of, I think it was the third game, the AlphaGo machine did something quite extraordinary that left commentators baffled as to why the machine had done that. But it turned out to be a winning move. And afterwards, it was described actually as a divine move by the commentators. And the machine was lauded for this. And Demis Hassabis, the creator, described this as, the person who got the whole thing going, as the machine being creative. And I understand what he meant by that. I have a close friend and colleague at Oxford called Roger Wagner, who's a very, very distinguished artist. We wrote a book together called The Penultimate Curiosity, and we've often discussed these things. And we were discussing in particular the case of a machine that had studied the works of Rembrandt in great detail and studied Rembrandt paintings, not just the images, but the 3D and the texture of the paint and things like that, and got to the point where it could create paintings, whereas it was extremely difficult for anyone who didn't know the whole corpus of Rembrandt's paintings to say whether this was a genuine Rembrandt or the one that had been made by the machine. And in the end, Roger brought the discussion to a conclusion. It was a public discussion by saying, this is what in other contexts would be called a forgery. Now, the machines can do writing. They can do sort of human lookalike writing. They can sometimes do creative fictional writing that it's quite hard to distinguish actually from human writing. They can create what I call musical wallpaper, the sort of music that you wish the restaurant or the hotel would switch off. And they can do that kind of thing. They can do good imitations of great composers, but I don't know of any great artist or musician or composer that is yet willing to ascribe to a machine original creativity in that sense.
Allison, do you want to comment quickly?
Sure, I can make
'cause I-
just a few very quick remarks. And I loved everything that you said. And there's obviously many thoughts pop up. But I think on the one hand, one could worry that AI is not novelty seeking enough in the sense that it may just kind of reconfirm existing biases, in the sense that, you know, it will inhibit the biases of its creators. And you've had that already, I think, when California used a few AI systems for really predicting the rate at which criminals would become offensive again, and that was deeply re-enshrining the racist prejudices that were available to the judges at the time. And I think that the partnership on AI actually did really interesting work there, and pointing out that this recursive bias. So one could worry that it's actually not creative enough, and it's just kind of like regurgitating existing biases. Then you have the middle ground, which is a little bit coming back to what you said, which is you do have like GPT-3, and you do have a variety of different AI systems now that actually really, I think, quite creatively engage with what different artists and also fantastic poets really have written, to extents where I almost think that they not only passed the Turing test, but actually human beings couldn't write that beautifully, or like that. Let's say me, at least, I couldn't write that beautifully in English as the AI writes, and I would certainly think that I couldn't pass the Turing test. But so I do think that I've seen a few bits and pieces of poems that were created that were just fantastic, like Ginsberg poems that were really creatively engaged with. And Beethoven, I think in AI, we recently reinterpreted Beethoven as well, and that obviously led to quite a stir in the musical world. But I think people are getting there, people are tweaking what's possible. And then on the long run, I do think that it has this creative energy that is just very different from the human, in the sense that it makes moves that are just I think this move that you were referring to was a very risky move, and I think that in that sense, because it thinks so differently, it doesn't have the same societal constraints than we do. It can lead us to do fundamentally new different things. But I am more interested actually in the creativity that comes from us cooperating with these AIs, because I think oftentimes when two fundamentally different sources cooperate, that's when the sparks fly, right? And so I'm really eager to see what could happen if we bring our both very different creative energies together, and cooperate and create new things that couldn't be possible for any one of these instances alone.
Okay, so again, it's a pity that we don't have a day to talk about this, because there's so many lines of inquiry I'd like to go down, but
Can I just pick up on one point?
yeah, please use my.
I love what you said about humans cooperating with AI. And if you take my example of the doctors or the judges, of course, the answer is you don't want either of those options. What you'd really like to have is a doctor who knows how to make the use of the best of AI. And I think the day will come, you'd want a judge who can make the use of the best of AI. And so I absolutely endorse what you said, that where the action is at is us learning to work with the machines to do better than we could do unassisted by the machines, and certainly better than the machines could do unassisted by us.
I also would like to just pick up on something that Alison raised, and just to put it out there, because I think we'll probably run out of time, that you say we struggle to come up with a system of values to embed in AIs. And of course, everyone understands that, but there's a much deeper problem. Even if we solve that problem, you're talking about the first generation of AIs, but they will be designing the next generation, so on. It's open-ended evolution. And the idea that we could embed a system of values that would endure in perpetuity seems an incredibly, it's one of these things that I can imagine a clever mathematician might be able to prove you couldn't do it. That's the real danger, that we unleash into the universe something with that unpredictable endpoint.
Okay, so terrific. So I'd like to come back to that, but I really want to take a facet of part of this, the example that Allison was talking about. And it's again, if we look at machine learning and so forth, and we wind up with a negative consequence, should we penalize the artificial intelligence somehow or whatever? And it gets into the whole the idea about rights and responsibilities. And Andrew, I think, gave a beautiful example about how quantum indeterminacy strips responsibility from you, because you can say, listen, the coin flipped, it wasn't my fault. And so this brings up rights and responsibilities. And so Kanta is going to join us and talk with us a little bit about this issue of rights and responsibilities. She has a terrific TED video that you should all take a chance to look at some point that touches on this. But Kanta, if you'd go ahead, I think I see you there in front of me, so please have at it.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Excellent.
Yes,
Thank you so much for having me remotely. I'm so sorry I wasn't able to travel. I know that it sounds odd that Professor Briggs is able to join from Oxford and I am not from Cambridge. These two places right now are apparently not as much alike as expected, because COVID cases in Cambridge are the highest in the country. And so we're going from one isolation period to another. To come back to the point at hand, the rights of humans and the rights of AI-powered robots, I am approaching that topic from a background in researching science narratives. So I look at the ways in which science is communicated to non-scientists, and also vice versa, at the point where public portrayals and public perceptions influence the scientific and technological status quo. And I think that is where the issue of robot rights and of AI personhood it's one of those issues where a very long history of narratives has very strongly influenced contemporary public perceptions, as well as the views of many scientists, and so therefore in some cases the direction science is taking. Because right now, I very strongly believe that the issue of robot rights at the moment is quite a non-issue, even though it is on many people's radars and there is a lot of thinking and debating going on about it. First of all, because like Professor Briggs pointed out, there are no robots in existence that have any kind of cognitive capacities, emotions, feelings, intelligence, life, anything that might warrant such rights the ways humans or animals do. But people speak of and actually convey rights and citizenship on unintelligent machines, so skillfully constructed puppets. And why is that? It's because we are expecting so much from these machines. We're expecting that these robots of today, especially those humanoid ones, the ones that can wink or do a backflip, that they are intermediary steps. The hope, no, even the expectation is that these machines will continue to develop into those amazing machines that we have been reading about literally for thousands of years, that we've been seeing on the big screens since film itself was invented. So we've been dreaming so long of those machines and the amazing things that they'll be able to do for us, that it's no wonder we can't wait until they're here. We're already planning ahead to what the world will look like when they arrive, even if we're talking about timescales of decades, if not centuries, if ever. And of course, so that's no bad thing in itself. I mean, it is good to be prepared. But in this particular case, society does skip straight to regulating future technology for a future utopia without preparing contemporary society so that we're all able to benefit from such a utopia. And so put concretely, I dislike the approach of starting to convey rights to machines in a world where so many demonstrably intelligent beings, so many humans, have fewer rights, and where so many are fighting for the same rights, such as the ones that come with citizenship, that have been conveyed onto these machines as a publicity stunt. there is this very famous paper called Robots Should Be Slaves by the roboticist Joanna Bryson. So I really recommend that to anyone interested in this angle on the debate. And so she is not saying that we should not grant rights to intelligent machines. She's not saying that we should treat these future idealizations of intelligent androids the way that people have enslaved and objectified other people throughout history and to this day. No. Instead, she argues that robots should be treated as objects without rights because they are objects. And in her words, in humanizing them, we further dehumanize real people. So the humanization of non-intelligent machines exacerbates the oppression of marginalized human groups, because it pushes those groups further down a hierarchy in which now even electronics have more rights than they do. And I think that point serves to inspire further reflection on the general theme of regulating future technology, because it's great to be prepared, but preparation should be proportional to probability and imminence. We don't yet need rights for robots, just like we don't yet need regulations on time travel or psionic warfare. But I would say a major step towards achieving the kind of utopia, to stick with the theme of the conference, the utopia in which everyone would agree on giving intelligent machines human rights and have them live among us peacefully, is to extend these rights to all humans first.
Thank you. I had to fumble my microphone. It's illuminated. It's illuminated, but it's not. Let's try that. It's still problematic here. Hello. Thank you, Pauline. All right. So this one seems to be. Yeah, that's right. We pass it around and it reactivates. So maybe that'll bring it. So thank you, Kanta, for that. I'm curious because you have this encyclopedic knowledge of the narratives that involve AI. What does your knowledge of that literature suggest as the most problematic right to that you could extend to a robot?
Well, it's a combination, I guess, of the kind of robot you're extending the right to, and the kind of rights that you're giving it. Because what you see very seldom in these narratives is these robots, I guess, abusing their rights. There are some really interesting and inspiring stories of intelligent machines trying to prove their humanity in order to be recognized as something similar to human. Isaac Asimov's Bicentennial Man is one that is really very interesting. Well, to stick with Isaac Asimov, for example, one thing that is shown to go wrong is to, I guess, over rely on the capacities of machines that aren't quite ready for it yet. So to give them too many rights and with those rights, responsibilities that they're not able to cope with. Even if, and so all of Asimov's robot stories, for example, hinge around these 3 laws of robotics that center on obeying humans, preserving oneself, and preserving other humans, so sacrificing oneself in order to save a human's life. All of those stories are about, well, this value alignment problem that has already come up, of that Allison mentioned, of robots not realizing how they should have interpreted those laws, and how humans expect them to act based on those laws. So that's where things go wrong. That's where people's lives get in danger. So yeah. These narratives usually tend to show us the dangers of not so much giving intelligent beings rights as giving unintelligent beings rights.
Okay, so again, it's interesting because there again there's the volitional aspect of it, that the AI may choose to do something, misunderstanding some set of values or some set of constraints that are important on it. So that was very interesting. Thank you for that. Any reactions on the panel to what Kanta had to say? Paul, would you like to?
Yeah, I just, we have a robot in our house. We've become very fond of it. It's a vacuum cleaner, and we always scurry around to make sure it has a nice life and doesn't get blocked and so on. But I think it'd be a long time before we felt it should be given rights. And as you were speaking and saying that this is a long way in the future, it seems to me the first step would be to give rights to non-human animals. And there's a big movement, at least among, to do that for primates and so on. That would sort of pave the way, it seems to me. That's really a comment rather than a question, but I see you're agreeing with me.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Now, there is also a long history of some animals being given more rights than some humans. And so, for example, speaking from my UK context, where up to the late 19th century, animals, especially horses owned by men, had more rights than the wives married to those men, because marriage implied ownership and no protection from domestic violence, whereas there were laws against animal abuse. Now that, of course, has fortunately much improved over the 20th and 21st centuries, but it is now indeed the case that people start thinking about, well, have we stagnated? No, we should be thinking about what exactly also distinguishes different kinds of animals, like you said, non-human primates. And there's some very sophisticated research that does tie into artificial intelligence research quite profoundly, I think, in looking at, well, what exactly are these criteria for sentience, understanding, intelligence, cognitive capacities? What exactly does that mean, and which animals have more and which have less, and therefore require more or fewer rights?
Yeah, and it picks up on again another point that Allison, I believe, made too, is that it's difficult for us to understand the cognition that's going on in a vacuum robot. I remember one of the most remarkable instances I recall was when the Challenger space shuttle broke up, and the last data frames that came back were intermittent or whatever, but there were 5 computers running the flight control software on the Challenger, and running different versions of software, and they would vote as to whether a particular action was necessary or not. And once they got 3 votes, then the action would be taken. And as the Challenger broke up, one of the last frames that came back was that 3 of the computers had voted to shut down the engines. And just, the fact that this was going on in the midst of this, we didn't even think of the fact that the software was actually polling itself to say, listen, how are things going right now? And so it was remarkable to see that we didn't even foresee that type of possibility, that type of thing going on. Now, I want to move, in the interest of time, to the last person on our panel here, but by no means the least, and that's to have Paul Davies talk a little bit about SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and artificial intelligence. It struck me when Paul and I were talking about this some time ago that you would figure that if there was a civilization that had managed to exist for 1 million years, they would have either figured out the Utopia thing or chucked it forever. And so I think talking about SETI and artificial intelligence is an interesting way to come at Utopia from the other side, from having addressed those issues and either having fixed them or rejected them. So Paul, you want to
Well, yes, thank you, Barry. Now, for something completely different. So whether or not we're alone in the universe is one of the oldest and deepest questions of existence. And for most of human history, it has been dominated by theologians and philosophers. But as I'm sure you all know, in the last few decades, scientists as well have contributed to this discussion, and it under the broad umbrella of a subject called SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. So the I in SETI is the same as the I in AI. And we can talk at length about how you go about this, but mostly it's sweeping the skies with radio telescopes in the hope of stumbling across a message from ET. And I've been involved with that ever since I was a student in one form or another. And for a while, I even chaired a curious organization called the SETI Post-Detection Task Group, which was set up by the International Academy of Astronautics. So had ET called on my watch, I should have been the first to know. So you might think that this would be a very powerful body, this task group, but it didn't have a budget. So it really couldn't do very much and certainly couldn't enforce anything in the event that there was some sort of contact. Now, we're part of this thing called CORES, and in that acronym is the R for religion. And there's a fascinating history about the notion of extraterrestrial beings. Are they persons? We've been talking about rights of AIs. What about extraterrestrial beings? Are they persons? Are they? Would they have rights? But in particular, in the Christian world, where over centuries this was discussed, what did it mean for salvation? Because Christianity is based on the notion of salvation. Would the aliens, is there a pathway to salvation? Expressed by my old friend John Polkinghorne, who was both a physicist and a theologian. Would God take on little green flesh to save little green men, is the way he expressed it. And so the uniqueness of the incarnation really raises a very deep theological problems. I was just discussing them yesterday with the former director of the Vatican Observatory, Jose Funes, and I put it to him. I said, well, what do you think? Well, he didn't give a straight answer. So there's this long tradition of anxiety about what salvation means and what personhood means when it comes to alien beings. But of course, it goes one notch further when if what we're talking about is artificial intelligence, and I think we should get away from that terminology altogether. We're talking really about designed intelligence, because what we might be dealing with for a civilization that's, say, 10 million years old, it would not so much be that the flesh and blood beings that handed over to silicon beings or something like that. You would have some sort of really probably hybrid technology involving organic and non-organic components. But the key thing is it's designed, it's not evolved intelligence. And so within the community of people that are concerned about SETI, there's this general sense that if we do ever find that we're not alone in the universe, almost certainly we're not going to be dealing with the proverbial little green men or indeed flesh and blood beings of any sort, but we would be dealing with some very advanced designed intelligence that might have intellectual capabilities of godlike proportions and be incomprehensible to us. And that's what we would expect. I should just say before closing that I'm completely open-minded about whether or not we are alone in the universe. I used to feel sort of, as I expressed it yesterday, in my soul, that we are not alone, that life on Earth is not a bizarre freak, and that the emergence of life and mind on Earth is, part of a more systematic outworking of complexification in the universe as a whole. That's really just a belief. In terms of, are they really out there? Is there any life out there altogether? I think we absolutely don't know. There is no evidence whatsoever at this time for any life beyond Earth, let alone intelligent life. And the transition from non-life to life remains deeply mysterious. We have no idea whether it's something that is going to happen very infrequently, or is life will pop up obligingly wherever conditions permit. We have no idea on that spectrum, so it's completely open for speculation as to whether they're out there. But if they are, it will be post-biological. I'm convinced of that.
All right, thank you, Paul. Andrew, you want to make a point?
Well, I love everything you said, Paul. Like you, I have no idea whether there's other intelligence of the kind that you're talking about in the universe. And I think it's open to empirical evidence. And there's one new piece of empirical evidence which has come in my lifetime, which is new, and that is that we now know of lots of other planets around lots of other stars.
Yes.
That we didn't know a generation ago.
Yes.
Of course, because we don't know how life began on Earth or came to Earth, we don't know whether it's probable or improbable, and therefore we don't know what to make of these observations of other planets in terms of the probability of intelligence.
That's right. It might have, if the probability of life emerging on an Earth-like planet in, say, 1 billion years is a trillion to 1 against, then the fact there might be 10 to the 23 planets potential sites doesn't make much of a dent in that. And that's the problem, because we might be dealing with a very small number.
The theological question about the theological implications of life elsewhere is one that's been discussed for a very long time, actually, much longer than exoplanets have been known. And I can gladly tell you my own view on this for what it's worth, which is that within the Christian faith, to which I belong as a follower of Jesus Christ, the remarkable event was God becoming physically embodied in Jesus. And I think all branches of the Christian tradition attribute great significance to the death of Jesus as something that achieved something that changed everything. And so the question is, or has been, would you need to have Jesus becoming, as you say, a little green man or something and dying for them? And I think that I'm pretty relaxed about this in the following way, that Jesus as a man in time and space was very specific. But we don't limit that to a concern of God for men only and not women. And we don't limit it to a concern only for people who lived in the 1st century and not in other centuries. And we don't limit it only to Jews, because it explicitly extends to Gentiles. And so you could continue. Now, without wanting in any way to diminish the uniqueness of what it means to be human and what is distinctive about humans, there is a sort of generality that you can kind of extend this. And, Paul talks about, the whole of redemption being significant. And to that extent, in a way that needs carefully sort of thinking through, to extend it to animals, to extend it to animal rights and so on, seems to me to be something I can actually be rather relaxed about, or indeed rather enthusiastic about.
But do you extend salvation to AIs?
I love that, to come back to it. I love that.
That was really the point.
Designed intelligences.
Design.
Well, and those designed intelligence, I mean, assuming that there is extraterrestrial intelligence that is now embodied in some silicon substrate or whatever, and is a fully designed intelligence, do you think it puzzles over why the universe seems to be so well designed for life like itself?
Well, I would have, I see, is there a sort of the equivalent of the anthropic principle for this other entity, whatever we're going to call it? Well, I'm assuming that anything of this nature, which would arise from a civilization been around for a long period of time, would have figured out a lot of science that we haven't, and would have answered all those sorts of questions to its satisfaction. But of course, we don't know that science is a completable program. We don't know that it's possible, however powerful an intellect that might appear, that it could come up with a total and complete answer to all the questions of existence. It may be that there's some that simply will be forever a mystery or unanswerable in some way, maybe for some Gödelian reason.
I mean, to put another spin on it, or another aspect of it, which a lot of people think about, I think quite fruitfully, it's been well observed that in practical terms, human moral judgments seem to involve everything that goes to making us human. So they seem to be more than simply rational calculation. They seem to involve other aspects of our humanity that at the moment, no amount, I'm going to call it machine learning to avoid the AI term, no amount of machine learning seems capable of emulating or even having a capacity for. And therefore people discuss whether or not you could ever get human levels of moral judgment in silico, or whether it has to be, carbon-based or based in some other sort of implementation. And I think that's quite a serious question that merits quite serious attention.
Yes. I want to address one question that came up earlier on the Who app, and now it's doing something strange. Stop it. I don't know what you're doing. It's good. Paul, your comment about SETI and I think the way I set it up as well, that you would have this intelligence that had been around for a long time and work things out. But of course, there's a premise there that's arguable, and that is that artificial intelligence would continue to evolve and get better and better. And one of the questions asked something I think very important now. Artificial intelligence today has capabilities that are hard to grasp fully. Could an occasion arise where some disaster, large-scale disaster, arose because of artificial intelligence that would lead to society swearing off artificial intelligence? I mean, we live in a society right now where I give up some of my privacy so I don't have to get up and switch off the lights. I can say, Alexa, do this.
No, it's terrible. I would never do that.
Yeah. Well, and you've got this robot doing who knows what while you and Pauline are sitting here. So the question is, at some point, I mean, it could be, who knows what it's doing.
Television does. It listens to what we say.
So can you see a time where society might just forswear artificial intelligence?
Absolutely. We could just get totally scared. We're unleashing Big Brother. I said earlier about the nth generation of artificial or design intelligence. It would have its own agenda. I could easily imagine that if this has been unleashed somewhere else in the universe, that the originating entity, species, whatever we want to call it, would have long since vanished, not necessarily been exterminated, but just got sort of trampled in the rush. To me, the other worrying thing about something like AI is that you can network them. I mean, humans form a loose network. We have something called society, but we don't, literally have a cable running from my brain to yours. But you can do this with artificial intelligence. You can have an entire surface of a planet, a gigantic throbbing brain. And then if that becomes a quantum computer with heaven knows how many qubits that will be involved, it becomes sort of, we cannot even imagine the type of intellectual activity we would be up against. And yet this could happen within a few centuries, or certainly a few thousand years. The universe is 13.8 billion years old. There were stars and planets around long before Earth even existed. The universe could be full of these incomprehensibly powerful, throbbing quintelligences out there with godlike capabilities. And then that raises the question, if we did make contact, would we have anything to say to each other? Would the gulf, the intellectual gulf, be so huge that we would just be largely irrelevant? So these are sort of scary thoughts. But your question was, should we ourselves head off that dismal future by putting some sort of embargo on the level that we develop? I don't suppose there's many people here who would want to see an embargo soon on development of AIs, but in another 50 years, it may be a different story.
Yes, Kanta, did you want to comment on that? I thought I saw that you signaled some way or another. So
yes, indeed. No, I think it's a really interesting question about the decision not to pursue further development of artificial intelligence. Even if it isn't embargoed, it might still happen, just the way that artificial intelligence research has been going through what they refer to as summers and winters, with the winters being several decades where artificial intelligence research just didn't get any funding, didn't get any attention, and very little happened. So this was particularly the 1990s and early 2000s was the most recent one. And so those kinds of hype cycles have been happening throughout history. You can also see it with other technologies where public rejection of the technologies has been so strong that the technology has not come to full fruition the way it maybe could have. So, for example, the Frankenfoods backlash to genetically modified foods. And in fiction, there's several really interesting examples of science fiction set in a future in which there is no AI for one reason or another. Samuel Butler was one of the first to write that in the very early 20th century in his novel Erewhon, in which there was a wholesale rejection of anything technological, mechanical, anything with moving parts in this sort of fictional semi-utopia called Erewhon. And that idea of this rejection of the increasing complexity of technology was then used by Frank Herbert in his Dune series, which is now up for an Oscar. In Dune, there is this sort of intergalactic society. There are these massive spaceships traveling, but there is no AI because of this event called the Butlerian Jihad, in which people rebelled, rose up against artificial intelligence and completely weeded it out of society. So it really shows a society that is extremely advanced in everything except the AI.
Okay, that's an interesting example. We are going to have to wrap up. Andrew, if you can make a quick point. We could spend the rest of the day talking about this. Unfortunately, we had 75 minutes and they're up. Andrew, you want to make a quick comment?
To me, it's inconceivable that we will stop developing machine learning. I think it'll be like saying, will we stop using the wheel or something? It won't happen. It's too useful. It's too valuable. But what I did want to do was to say that it's good to think ahead. It's good to think far out about these distant possibilities and how we prepare for them now, as long as we also pay attention to the here and now and the issues we've currently got. We talk about giving rights to AI. How about implementing the rights for humans, which we're so poor at the moment and where there's so much deficiency? And there's plenty of use and abuse of the machine learning, now, this year, this week, that we need to pay attention to and to prepare for. And to me, I just want to show you a little book that I've written on human flourishing, because one of the ways of addressing the uses here and now, as well as in the long term, is to ask, what does it actually mean for humans to flourish? And therefore, how do we use, amongst other things, the technological resources at our disposal in order to be able to promote that, not only for generations to come, but also in the world that we're living in now.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would love to go around and do, and we've got several questions here that we didn't get to. Thankfully, they're in Whova, and our speakers can take a look at them and take a stab at them. Will you please join me in thanking our panelists? Okay, so we're going to wrap up here. We're going to take a lunch break. Those of you who are viewing the CORES meeting online, we have some lunch and learn videos and things like that, conversations as well. Please take advantage of those. And I see Allison waving there. I'm not sure waving at. Oh, she can still see us. Okay, so we're waving at you, Kanta. Please take advantage of those if you're viewing online. We'll be starting back up this afternoon with 2 more conversations. And so I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.
Can you still hear me? Oh.
Very few of us go very far in our day before encountering the invisible hand of artificial intelligence, prompting us to buy this or that, to turn right up ahead, reminding us of an impending appointment and so forth. Beyond that presence, we're continually exposed to claims about what such tools may do in the future. So we want to take a look in this brief conversation about what we mean by artificial intelligence. What are the more reasonable expectations for future achievements in artificial intelligence? And what might be perils, the perils of such tools? This is a huge subject. And I had the pleasure of scratching the surface of this very big subject with two renowned thinkers, two friends and colleagues. First of all, John Lennox, Professor Emeritus of Mathematics and the History of Science at Oxford University. Regents Professor of Physics Paul Davies of Arizona State University, who is also the director of Beyond, the Center for Fundamental Concepts in Science. I'm Barry Ritchie. I'm a professor of physics in the Department of Physics at Arizona State University, ASU, and an affiliated faculty member with ASU's Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. I have turned off my Alexa, so I think that we can speak comfortably, gentlemen. And so to begin with, John, in your most recent book, 2084, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Humanity, you distinguish between artificial intelligence and artificial general intelligence. What's the difference there? What's the difference that you're trying to draw out?
Well, thanks, Barry. I'm really delighted to be associated with ASU today. I think it's probably easiest to say that AI has been defined as the theory and development of computer systems that can perform tasks that normally require human intelligence, such as those you mentioned, visual perception, speech recognition, and so on. And narrow AI, which covers probably most of the AI that's up and running today, typically involves doing one thing that normally takes human intelligence, and of course does it much more efficiently. Whereas artificial general intelligence is the concept of creating a system that can do everything, or mostly everything a human can do, but much more and much faster. And therefore, within that concept is the attempt to, in the end, produce what one might call a superintelligence in one of two distinct ways. One is the idea of enhancing existing humans by adding technology, and the other is post-biological, building an AGI system on a silicon base or similar. So those are the two different things.
All right. Now, where would you say we are in those two projects that you've described? Would you say that one is a pipe dream and the other one is reality, or how would you characterize it, John?
Well, I would say that the first one is very much a reality, and we're all aware of it every day. And because it's a reality, I think that, well, all technology I liken to a knife. A really sharp knife, you can use it for surgery or you can use it for murdering people. That is, it raises ethical problems. And it's powering ahead at a fantastic rate. And some of the things that are being done are really quite spectacular. I think one of the most recent is the way in which DeepMind has been able to calculate protein folding of thousands and thousands of proteins. That is something absolutely spectacular, and we may expect more of the same. Now, AGI tends to be mainly the stuff of science fiction, but of course, we have to wait and see just where narrow AI is going. And as it broadens out, I would expect that the technologies become much more than doing one single thing. But science fiction writers love AGI.
Okay, so science fiction writers certainly have some very high hopes for AGI. And now, Paul, in your just finished book, What's Eating the Universe and Other Cosmic Questions, you said, and I'll quote here, so forgive me for reading this, on Earth, designed intelligence usually called artificial intelligence or AI, is already penetrating many areas of human activity. It can do mathematics better than we can, and increasingly make decisions about complex systems. It is easy to imagine that in a few decades, most of the intellectual heavy lifting on Earth will be done by AI that will likely far outstrip the human brain and capability. So Paul, could you elaborate on that view and set it in its context?
Well, let me look back over my lifetime. And when I was a student, I loved to read science fiction. I can remember reading I, Robot by Isaac Asimov. And I thought all of this stuff was just around the corner, much as we thought after watching 2001, A Space Odyssey, that we'd have cities on the moon by the year 2000. And it was a very disappointing few decades when it looked like robotics and what we now call AI were really going nowhere, that it had been greatly overblown. But then suddenly, I think in the last 20 years, it all seemed to come together and there were huge advances. I even remember a meeting at Google where not so many years ago, where a friend of mine suggested that they should put more effort into devices that would translate languages. So if you go to a restaurant in China, you could speak in English and the waiter would see it in Chinese. This has happened. So enormous advances. But I think in the context of what we're trying to achieve at this meeting, that we're less concerned with the sort of gee-whizzery. It's obvious that amazing things can be done and done very efficiently and better than human beings. But the intelligence is, I think, the second issue. I think what we're all more concerned about is consciousness, something like that, self-awareness, moral direction, and so forth. In other words, we're not terribly much frightened by a system that flies a plane better than, or even drives a car better than a human being once we get used to it. But when we get into the area of simulating not just intelligence, but making the claim that we can build a system that is conscious, is in some sense a being, and may or may not have some sort of moral awareness, then that starts to get much more scary. And if we then go to even further in the future to the notion that such beings might displace humans, so we would be sort of irrelevant, then that raises huge numbers of questions. So I think intelligence is not really the right thing to dwell on. It is really more aspects of consciousness, self-awareness, moral values, and so forth.
Well, just to follow up on that, Paul, do you consider, is consciousness just a form of computation then? Or is it something not just quantitatively, but qualitatively different than calculation?
There's a deep philosophical problem, which is, of course, well known, which is how do we know if something is conscious? And people have arguments, you know, is my dog conscious? And most dog owners think that their dogs are conscious. And then if you had a sort of robotic dog that responded in the same way, could you attribute consciousness to it? Well, Alan Turing, one of the founders of this entire discipline, came up with this notion of the Turing Test. So am I talking to Barry, a real conscious human being, or is this some sort of simulation that is responding appropriately, but without any awareness of what it is doing? And how can I tell the difference? If you can design a system that can respond appropriately in a way that's indistinguishable from another human being, then according to the Turing test, you would attribute consciousness to it. But it is just by analogy. I know I am conscious. You behave in a manner similar to me, and so I attribute consciousness to you. But it's really only a working hypothesis. I cannot know you are conscious without being you, and then, of course, I wouldn't be me. So this is deep philosophical problem's always been there of attributing consciousness to something else. And I think probably most people would go on the basis of familiarity, that if you had a robot or something like that around that was so well designed that it responded appropriately, you would treat it as if it's conscious. But whether it really is, it's called the hard problem of consciousness, whether you can really say it is conscious, it's a problem that I'm not sure we will ever solve. It may be beyond the scope of science to actually solve it.
Okay, so John, you want to jump in here? What's your view? Do you feel, well, let's talk about the question of consciousness first of all. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm conscious that there's a problem. And my first reaction is I'm interested in Paul's emphasis here, because I've just been listening to the Wreath lectures, which are a famous series of lectures. And this year or last year, December, they were given by Stuart Russell. And one of the things I picked up from what he said was that he was involved in the following project. Here's how he put it. He said, "We are interested in creating programs that behave intelligently. The additional project of making them conscious is not one that we are equipped to take on, nor one whose success we would be able to determine." And he traces his stance to Turing himself, who did admit that there was a mystery to consciousness, but he didn't think it was necessary to solve it to construct an AI system. Now, it seems to me, thinking about this, that just as AI simulates intelligence without actually being intelligent, I love the paper of a pioneer. He's in his 90s now. I met him, a man called Mellichamp of the University of Alabama. He wrote a paper with the title, "The artificial in artificial intelligence is real." In other words, he's pointing out that we mustn't forget it's not actually intelligent. So I do see a real difference in simulation and actuality. And I take Paul's point that it's very difficult with the Turing test to tell the difference. But one of the big problems, as I understand it, reading on consciousness studies, is we still have no idea what consciousness actually is. So that seems to me to be a massive barrier. So that means that Paul mentioned the ethical problems and the scariness of this, and I agree with that absolutely entirely. But what we need to do in the meantime is that any ethical dimension to the systems we have so far has to be programmed in by human operators. And so their ethics, their worldview is going to be built in. So the major question is, what worldview are we building into these machines, whether they're actually espousing it or whether they're simply simulating it?
Yeah,
So,
could I jump
yes,
in there? Because I
please
think
do,
I
Paul.
absolutely agree with John. So the first step is there a universal set of values we agree across the world that we would build in at this level? That's a hard enough problem. But even if there is, then the difficulty, the real risk that I see with unleashing AI with no controls is that very soon the first generation of AIs, if we can call them that, are going to design the next generation, and so on. Because of our feeble brains, we will lose track of exactly what these design principles are. We will just marvel at the products that these AIs produce. And then we can imagine, N generations of these AIs, the descendants of the descendants of the descendants into the far, far future. If we embed a system of values at the first level, there's absolutely no guarantee that that system of values will be there in 1,000 generations' time when they've redesigned themselves. And because there's nothing, unlike humans, we can't sort of plug ourselves together and achieve a collective intellect. These systems can. They can cover a whole planet, some sort of super brain, and the mind boggles, to use a term, as to the capabilities, but also the values of what a system like that might be. And you might think, well, this is so far in the future, who cares? But the one time that I have been brought up against this, and other people who dabble in SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, is, supposing we are not alone in the universe and there are other civilizations out there, and we are contacting such a civilization, extraterrestrial intelligence, what will it be like? And I think we've come to the overwhelming conclusion that it would be post-biological, and that it might be have this sort of super intellect, and with a system of values that, even if there is a common system of values, not just across the planet, but across the universe, is there any guarantee that what we'd be dealing with would see eye to eye with us on anything? And so that is the sort of scary aspect of SETI and extrapolating into the far, far future.
Yeah, well, in extrapolating there, Paul, maybe we take a step back and because in talking about artificial intelligence, designing artificial intelligence, there's a goal, a telos there that I'd like to step back from. Let's just go back to what you said in your book for a second. You said that AI can do mathematics better than we can. Now, exactly what did you mean there? Because most of us consider mathematics not necessarily a plug and chug type of endeavor, that there is creativity and originality and so forth. So when you say that artificial intelligence can do mathematics better than we can, what exactly did you mean by that? It certainly can do basic math. It can certainly do sums a whole lot faster than we can, but I don't think that's what you meant.
Well, maybe I should have said better than I can, but maybe not better than John. Of course, when I first started using computers, they were just known as really stupid calculating machines that were just very fast, but had no idea what they were doing. And indeed, back in the 70s, it was almost impossible to get computers to do anything other than just sort of basic arithmetic and statistics. But then they became better and better. Packages like Mathematica and so on enable people to do not just algebra, but calculus and fairly advanced computations. And I think it's got to the point now where mostly, I don't make a lot of use of this, but I have students who do. Mostly, I would feel that using a computer was the way to go. But of course, what I think you're referring to is, with the creativity, is new mathematics. So mathematicians, of course, all the time are coming up with new concepts, defining new mathematical objects and relationships, and it's an infinite universe of possibilities. Mathematics is open-ended, and human beings have a wonderful creative ability to find new and interesting aspects of mathematics that I think probably computers at the moment don't have. So as a creative activity, almost an artistic activity, I think humans still have the edge. But there's some other area which disturbs me a little bit, and I think it disturbs a lot of mathematicians, which is coming up with mathematical proofs. So there's some famous unsolved problems. I think people know, for example, about Fermat's last theorem. What I know is solved. But there are a number of these. And the question is, if you get a computer to work on one of these things, and it says there, I proved it, and you look through what the computer has done, and it really means nothing to us, how do we know? How can we tell what's happened? And this was done many years ago with the 4-color problem, this famous problem that on a map, what is the minimum number of colors you need so no two adjacent countries have the same color, whatever their shapes and so on, and it turns out it's 4. It's always supposed to be 4, and a computer proved it, but I'm not aware that any human being has sort of gone through and said, yes, well, the computer got it right. We never thought of doing it that way. So that leads us into this whole territory of where, do we just trust computers even though we don't know what's going on in their mighty heads? Or do we somehow feel that things will only ever be fully understood if a human being, and in particular mathematician, can look through and have that aha moment, as Roger Penrose described it so well. That sort of everything falls into place. Now I see it. Might be a very counterintuitive result, but aha, that's the proof. I can see how all this works.
Okay,
Maybe this will no longer. This will be a thing of the past.
So John, you have a dog in this fight because as a mathematician, how would you respond to Paul's comments there?
Well, I found Paul's comment really very interesting. And certainly looking back, computers were a great tool. And then when the four-color problem was solved in quotations, it raised a storm of discussion as to whether this is valid kind of proof and so on and so forth. But what I thought he meant was that he was referring to something relatively recent, and that is the way in which AI has actually been able to suggest some very deep connections to mathematicians, which they have then gone on to prove. And it's only a month ago that Nature published an article describing how Google's DeepMind was set the task of discerning patterns and connections in the mathematical fields of knot theory and representation theory. And to the surprise of the mathematicians involved, new connections were suggested, and they were able then to examine the connections and prove the conjecture that AI suggested. And these kind of results are suggesting increasingly that machine learning can complement mathematical research and guide intuition. And here in the University of Oxford, using machine learning identified patterns, mathematicians have discovered a connection between algebraic and geometric invariance of knots and established a completely new theorem in the field. Whereas a group working with them in the University of Sydney used the connections made by the AI to get them much closer to proving a conjecture about polynomials, which has been on the books for 40 years. So this seems to be almost a qualitative change in the capacity to use AI, but you're not getting rid of the mathematicians that fast. Their intuition is necessary to make those connections. But what to my mind would be very fascinating, and I just go back to what Paul was saying, it would be very interesting to see something like DeepMind solve Fermat's last theorem ab initio. That would be a very interesting thing to see if that could be done. So I think we still need the mathematicians, although of course the AI systems are working much faster, but you need the mathematical intuition to get the aha moment. I see the connection, here it is.
Okay, but to take Paul's point a little bit further, you said that the software, the computers had identified connections. Isn't that doing mathematics, identifying connections?
No, well, it is, of course, doing mathematics. The computer is doing mathematics every bit as much, I think, as in earlier days when I first saw a computer in Cambridge, a vast thing that filled a room, and it did a little bit of numerical analysis for me. So I constructed a program by punching holes in cards and all this kind of thing. And that reminds me that I remember thinking I ought to go into computing, and I approached my tutor at college, and he said, "Mr. Lennox, I really thought that you would be interested in being a serious mathematician. Computers are not for you." I could have been in at the foundations, but there you are, you see.
See, since the computers didn't have pride,
the computer didn't object
to your tutor's argument there.
That's right.
Yeah, so we're about halfway through the time we have. So I wanted to essentially pick up a thread that both of you have been brought up, and I'd like to spend a little time talking about that. John, since we were talking, let me start with you. John, what do you see as the greatest peril arising in the advance of artificial intelligence or artificial general intelligence. And just to keep the scope somewhat on the real plane, let's say within the next 60 years. So that would take us roughly to the time, roughly to 2084. And I know that type of extrapolation is already pretty rickety. I recall Ray Kurzweil's plot where he showed how we would get greater and greater computational power, so that sometime, I think it was 2008, we would be able to have the consciousness of a mosquito. And I want my mosquito, right? I want to know what it feels like to be a mosquito. Well, that hasn't happened yet. So, but in the next 60 years, John, what do you see as the greatest peril arising in the advance of artificial intelligence?
Well, my first reaction is to define what I would call the singularity constant. That is, the singularity is always at least 30 years in the future. But coming seriously to your question, I don't think you need to go 60 years into the future, because narrow AI is raising huge problems. Let's just take one area, and that is facial or bodily movement recognition. That can be used to detect criminals in a crowd, and police forces are using it. But we know in our world today that it can be also used as surveillance technology to suppress an ethnic minority and create huge problems for groups of people. So we're already there in the scary side of narrow AI. Now, I'm well aware that people like the late Stephen Hawking, they were scared. He said, the real risk with AI is not malice, but competence. A super intelligent AI will be extremely good at accomplishing its goals, and if those goals aren't aligned with ours, we're in trouble. But I really feel that the problem that's faced at the moment is that the technology is outpacing the ethics at a colossal speed, and that the business of building ethical norms into systems, the arms race, of course, is a particular example with autonomous weapons and all this kind of stuff, which we could come on to. But I'm concerned at the moment with what we observe, even with the simplest of things, the fact that my shopping leaves a digital trail. And there's a thing that has been called surveillance capitalism. There's a fascinating book by a woman called Shoshana Zuboff of MIT, and it's a very serious book pointing out that what's happening, partly with our permission, because we wear the digital technologies in our smartphones, but the information that's being harvested without our permission is being sold on, and billions are being made from that kind of thing. That raises massive problems of the intrusion of privacy and so on. So the next 60 years seem to be going to make that a great deal worse, unless we find some way of policing this thing, of somehow controlling it. And that is a major problem that people are beginning to realize. And you'll find there are several efforts where you get many leading thinkers in artificial intelligence signing documents and saying, we've got to develop ethical principles, like, for example, the Asilomar principles for AI. So that's where the problem lies.
So Paul, do you agree that John's put his finger on the greatest peril there, or do you think there's another more significant than that?
Well, I started out by giving this sort of grandiose million-year view of multi-generational AIs as the long-term worry, but in the short term, of course, we're a long way from that. And Frank Wilczek has remarked in connection with this subject that he's less concerned about artificial intelligence than about human stupidity. And I think what John is referring to in this intermediate phase is where we have a combination of both. So we have the power of artificial intelligence to do the bidding of but in some cases, bad actors. So they have at their disposal this enormous technology, and surveillance is, of course, one that I deeply share anxieties about, because in many cases we're throwing away the very rights and privileges that our forebears fought for, and they've all been tossed away just within a decade or two, sometimes on just rather trivial grounds of convenience, for example. So that is obviously a worry. But one of the things John alludes to in his book, but if you make a comparison, say, he mentioned about the knife, of course, a good example, more contemporary example is nuclear power. I wouldn't be talking to you now, incidentally, if it wasn't for the nuclear power station here in Arizona, which is providing at least some of the electricity that we're using. But we don't worry too much about, a crazy student in Belarus or something making a nuclear bomb in his bedroom. But when it comes to AI and computer hacking and access to the enormous computational power that is networked around the world, we can imagine a crazy student and unleashing something quite terrible. And of course, it has happened with just simple malware and so forth, but it could easily go well beyond this, that if you can harness this ability by hacking into it, then that seems to me to present all sorts of dangers. So we really are in unknown territory, and we don't know how to regulate it. I don't know what the institutions might be that would regulate it.
Yeah, I think the mental picture that you were drawing there too, human stupidity may simply be human curiosity. It's like placing a loaded gun in a kindergarten. The kids are going to pick it up, and just out of curiosity. And so it may not actually be with malevolent intent. It may simply be that curiosity gets the better of the human race. So the advance of AI seems to be unstoppable. So how can we possibly avoid the perils that you two have discussed here? What sources or source of values or virtues are available to backstop humanity from falling prey to those perils? And I think a couple times the phrase universal values has been vocalized here. What values and virtues are universally shared among cultures? I mean, I think I live in a culture where it's not clear that we have shared values and virtues any longer. So let's go back to the initial question. John, let me start with you. How do you think we can possibly avoid the perils that we've been talking about here?
Well, this is a huge problem, but the question of universal values is the first thing I think to address. Now, cultures clearly differ in many ways, but they don't differ as much as all that. Well, what I mean by that is this. Years ago, I think it was 1940, C.S. Lewis wrote a prescient book, really, called The Abolition of Man. It's got an appendix. And in the appendix, he traced through all the world's major religions, philosophies, and cultures, and discovered that there was a set of common values. And it's quite remarkable. I remember coming across it as a teenager. He called these illustrations of natural law. And in particular, he found that every civilization, every religion, every culture, even Roman pagan religion, humanism, all the rest, all had what we now often call the golden rule. Do unto others as you would they did unto you. So that's there. And from where I sit, I reckon that because that appears to be hardwired into every human being, then society doesn't completely fall apart. You mentioned the word backstop. And it seems to me that we need to remind ourselves of these values, and they seem to be, in that sense, pretty absolute. I often say to people, what about torturing babies? Is that wrong? And people think it's absolutely wrong. So there's one absolute for a start. We can start there. The problem, it seems to me, is not so much recognizing that there's a common base on which we operate. The problem is compliance, as many companies these days have discovered. How do you get the mission statement, the ethical mission statement of a company into the hearts of its executives? That's one of the problems. And it seems to me here that you have several different ways of grounding those values. And I think in thinking about it, we need to distinguish between the values that exist and the arguments people use to ground them. And they're basically three. First of all, that universal objective values are grounded in the matter of the universe and have simply proceeded by the laws of nature, etc., etc. And then others believe that values are creations of human beings. And then there finally is the position that I take, that they're grounded in the character of God, the creator. So there's those three grounds, but it seems to me that the justification for absolute moral values is distinct from their existence. And the problem of, if you like, enforcing them, although maybe that's not the right word, is this. The dominant ethical system, and there are several ethical systems in our world, is preference utilitarianism, which roughly says you argue in the maximum benefit for the maximum number of people. It's a consequentialist ethic. And that works really well if there are equal centers of powers on the planet. If you're dividing ice cream among kids, you'd better use utilitarianism and give them exactly the same amount or you're in trouble. But the problem is that we live in a planet where the centers of power, particularly in this area, are not equal. And the difficulty is, if I have enough power that I don't care what you do to me, you say to me, look, if you do X, I will, and I'll say, yes, you will what? And this is exemplified in Hitler's day. In his political infancy, he drew up treaties. The moment he got the power, he tore them up. And I think that's a huge problem that we face today. And I don't know the answer to it at all, not really.
Okay, so Paul, you want to weigh in on this?
Yes, a couple of points that I want to make. So one is even before we hit these sort of really major issues about global values, there are AI specialists who wrestle with dilemmas. There's a famous one, and I'll sort of paraphrase it, but self-driving car. Does it swerve to avoid a mother with a baby in a stroller and hit an old person on the sidewalk? As a sort of there's a better outcome. Do we tend to sort of attach more value to young lives because their life expectancy is greater? That's I don't know what I would do in those circumstances, but these people have to program those things in. We've hit it in a very practical way in the COVID era because some people are saying, well, most of the people who are dying are going to die soon anyway, and why should the rest of us suffer health consequences and economic disruption, to save the lives of some old people? And other people say, an old person's life is worth just the same as a young person's life. I'm not going to get drawn into what I believe on this, but the thing is, we have difficulty already deciding. Now, I'm sure, I certainly know there is in Britain, there are algorithms to sort of work out how you allocate resources among people, and you have to build some sort of ethical standards into those algorithms. So we hit these things in a very practical way already. And I think there will be disagreements. There are disagreements between the UK and the US on the nature of those algorithms.
So this is a very difficult one, but let me also make another comment which occurred to me as John was speaking. You know, what would it take to get some sort of global regulation? And maybe what it takes is some really horrible accident or incident. And I'm thinking that we've had decades where the nuclear threat has always been there, but so far we've avoided it. And the demonstration of the horror of nuclear weapons in Japan at the end of World War II, you know, maybe was necessary. If that hadn't happened, then nuclear war may well have broken out in the 50s and so on. So maybe it requires one really nasty thing to happen. In the case of AI, would be some sort of calamity, national calamity, which we would survive, but we thought never again. So we want to reach that sort of never again moment. And maybe, I'm afraid to say, maybe that's the only way we're ever going to get to some sort of global control.
I think that's a very prescient comment. I mean, I think the key, perhaps, is you mentioned the threat of nuclear annihilation. Even though the world powers at that time were adversaries, they all recognized the existential danger presented by their tools and pulled back from the brink. It may be that what it's going to take is some real understanding of the existential threat represented by artificial intelligence, unconstrained by morality, unconstrained by nationality, and things like that. I mean, as one of the examples that John presented earlier was of the use of artificial intelligence to oppress minorities. There you have the state wielding the power, but maybe if the leaders of that state recognize that the pendulum can swing back the other way, they would recognize with the rest of the world's leaders that this is an existential threat for human life as we know it on the planet, and be more eager to step forward to do something about it. John, do you have a further comment, or?
Well, I listened to the Reith lectures, and Stuart Russell said an interesting thing at the end of the second one. He said there are 8 billion people wondering why you cannot give them some protection against being hunted down and killed by robots. If the technical issues are too complicated, your children can probably explain them to you. And what he's referring to is this whole question of automatic weapons, and in particular swarms of drones. And I could imagine, thinking of Paul's scenario of something absolutely awful happening, we could have a catastrophe where many civilians are killed by one of these coordinated AI-directed swarms of killer drones. And then we might get something like the shock of saying never again, it must never happen again. And I think it's right to look back over history and realize that there was some success in terms of nuclear banning and so on. We haven't blown the planet up yet. We've held back, and there was a group of scientists at the time in some of these areas. They stopped working on these things, and I found it very interesting that in Google in particular, coming up to the modern day, working on some of these automatic weapon things, I think it was Google, the scientists actually refused to do any more research and left. So personal protest is important. You know, I can't solve all the world's global problems, but it seems to me that each of us has a responsibility to see what role we can play in this. And I myself think it's very important to folk like Paul, who stand very high in this kind of field and area with the kind of attitudes that he is able to share. And I think that that's absolutely marvelous to see. And it's hugely important we've people of integrity having input and perhaps that can have influence. But for each of us, and for me personally, it seems to me that questioning the whole basis of moral values and what our worldview is, that's important, because if I change and you change, and that brings us closer to one another, then it brings us in common towards a much more balanced sense of coexistence.
Okay, and well, with that hopeful comment, I think we're going to have to bring our discussion to a close. We've raced right through the 45 minutes. I feel like we're seeing the racers come around the last stretch, but now we're going to cut to a commercial. So I do appreciate the fact, John and Paul, that you've allowed me to participate in this discussion. It's been a very thought-provoking, and again, I hope ultimately hopeful discussion about how we may think about these issues. You've certainly given us much to think about. To those of you who are listening to this conversation and have become intrigued by the issues that we've discussed briefly here, I really hope that you'll follow up and read both Professor Lennox's new book, 2084, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Humanity, and Professor Davies' new book, What's Eating the Universe and Other Cosmic Questions, to get further insight into the questions we've explored here and more. So thank you for joining us, and thank you once again, John and Paul.
My pleasure. Thank you, Barry.
It's been my pleasure. Lovely to do it with you, Paul.